So, Dave, again, I want to thank you for writing the article for the newsletter, for inviting the panelists, putting this discussion together, and thank you for all of this. Please proceed, sir.
Thank you, Charles. I am David Osgo, the Rincon Point neighbors on the Embarcadero. We got involved in this when we found out that a number of high-rises nearby are not rooted on bedrock, including the 43-story One Market high-rise. And so we decided to look into it further. And we're pretty alarmed about what we discovered. Let me introduce our panelists. If you could wave or something when I say your name, that would be, or raise your hand, that would be great. Dr. Thomas Heaton is with us from Caltech. Dr. Kit Miyamoto, Global CEO of Miyamoto International. And he's a member and past chair of the California Seismic Safety Commission, though he is not speaking on behalf of the commission tonight. Laurel Mathews is with us, great, of the city's Office of Resilience and Capital Planning, which has an excellent database on 180 of the tallest buildings in San Francisco, with 43 data points on those buildings. So it's a massive database that the planning department didn't have and DBI didn't have. I encourage everybody to.
But it is public on our website, so they do have access. It's on Data SF.
Very easy to access. You don't have to download anything. You don't have to register, and you can even sort the data. It's easier to sort than Excel, I think. So it's a wonderful resource, and it's great they did that. So the things we discovered, I'll just do a quick list of kind of the highlights. We discovered that 114 specific tall buildings in the city are on soil with a, quote, very high liquefaction potential. Most of these buildings do not rest on bedrock, according to what we understand. 43 tall buildings, including the Transamerica Pyramid, have relatively shallow MAT foundations, which is the same kind of foundation the Millennium Tower has. So we know how well that worked. They rest on dry soil, which seems to work pretty well as long as it's dry, but the Millennium being the exception. And 25 of those 43 are on soil with a very high potential for liquefaction. The city has not set a deadline still for retrofitting the 39 specific tall buildings known for nearly 30 years to have weak steel framework welds, even though other cities have. And the city continues to arbitrarily maintain weaker earthquake standards for buildings under 240 feet, including the one I'm in right now. And lastly, of the 180 buildings, only 8 are indicated to have been retrofitted. So plenty to work to be done. I see Dr. Keith Porter has joined us. Welcome, Keith. He is calling in, I believe, from Quebec, but is with the University of Colorado. And Kit just came back from Turkey, so we're looking forward to receiving his input. Let's see, Kit, I believe you said you had to leave early, so I'll turn it over to you. If you want to share what you learned in Turkey. And
yeah, sure. Actually, I can stay till 7:30, so I'm okay. You know, I clear my schedule. maybe more appropriate have the Professor Heaton to discuss about overall risk and stuff like that. Be probably more appropriate. I got a feeling of it. What do you think, Thomas?
Sure, I've got quite a bit to say. I mean,
I'm sure you do.
I'm a little concerned that I would cut off your time. But
That's okay, Tom.
I'm happy to. Maybe it would be good, Kit, if you interrupted me at various times to chime in with additional information.
So, Professor Heaton, I love to do that kind of things.
Yeah, I don't see any reason to make this especially formal. Do you want me to just get started right now?
Let's get the show on the road.
All right, let me try and share my screen. Is that sharing now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, let me. So just to start, I'm actually not a structural engineer. Let's be clear about that. My background is physics. It's kind of unusual. I started out my career in geophysics, studying earthquake physics and how the ground moves in close to earthquakes. And about 30 years ago, Caltech decided that I was a good candidate to be a joint position in geophysics and also in civil engineering, which was quite a shock to me because I'd never taken much civil engineering. And suddenly I had to teach classes in civil engineering, which meant I had a lot of learning to do. And through the years, I've worked with many excellent civil engineers at Caltech. I've picked up some civil engineering. I've tried to take what I've learned from the civil engineering and merge it together with what I know about the physics of earthquakes. And I think I have a pretty unusual perspective. Not many other people combine these different areas. And I can tell you, it's a difficult problem. So Kit and Keith, correct me when you need to. So here's sort of the summary of my talk. Often people, when they talk about what earthquakes are like, they talk about what are the accelerations of the ground, what are the peak accelerations. They're thinking force equals mass times acceleration. And as it turns out in our business, peak acceleration really characterizes what the high frequency part of the shaking is about. High frequency to me means greater than 5 hertz, which is in the audible range. You couldn't even hear it, but for buildings, that's high frequency. And I'll say that when you look at the high frequencies in earthquakes, it turns out when you get in close to big earthquakes, they saturate with magnitude. So as the magnitude of an earthquake goes up, the intensity of the shaking goes up. But when you get in close to big earthquakes, it doesn't matter how big the magnitude is. They all have about the same peak acceleration. And if you do the statistics on peak acceleration, you'll find that the statistics are the standard kind of actuarial statistics that you would see for things like auto accidents or heart attacks or murders, things that you could write life insurance policies for. And statisticians know how to do this problem. But as it turns out, even though we can do the statistics, the peak acceleration is really an irrelevant parameter for what happens to tall buildings. It doesn't matter what the peak acceleration is in almost any case for a tall building. What's more important for tall buildings are the parameters of how fast the ground's moving, the peak ground velocity, which is the integral of acceleration, and the displacement, how far does the ground move during the shaking. And those are given by the abbreviation PGV and PGD. Those are the things that matter to tall buildings. And it turns out that the statistics of PGV and PGD are very different kind of statistics than the statistics for high frequencies. And in fact, they're described by what we call power laws or heavy-tailed probability distributions. And these are the probability distributions that are used to describe things like COVID or wars or pestilences. Think if you had to predict how many people will die in a war next year, the statistic, you can't use statistics to predict that problem, but that's the kind of statistics that's necessary for tall buildings. And in the United States, current probabilistic design is used for tall buildings and also for base isolated building. And it uses design motions that generally are smaller than is widely accepted in earth sciences. So as I said, I'm kind of unusual because I typically go to engineering meetings and I go to earth science meetings, but most people don't have the patience to go to both sets of meetings. And by going to those meetings, I've seen that there's been some inconsistency between those two communities, earth scientists and earthquake engineers. And the key issues that I'll talk about are what it's like in close, I call it near source ground motions, less than 10 kilometers from the rupture. In the case of San Francisco, we're mainly thinking about the San Andreas Fault or possibly the Hayward Fault on the other side of the bay. And the reason I'll talk about them is just simply because they're much simpler to deal with, and they're probably the most important. So as it turns out, modern high-rise buildings and base isolated buildings both, they've never experienced large long period ground motions. And by large long period ground motions, I mean that the ground moves more than a meter, 3 feet during the shaking. But they will. I mean, it's just kind of simple physics that if the fault moves 3.5 meters like it did in 1906, the ground near the fault will move by a couple of meters. But no one's ever seen a building go through that kind of ground motion in the past. And now people are using statistical arguments to tell you about how often large buildings should collapse in big earthquakes. And I'll argue that statistical prediction of the long period peak ground displacement, I'm not even sure, but I don't think it's actually technically feasible. If it is technically feasible, I think it will look very different from what the current practice is. And the real key question out there is, if you could look 100 years in the future, will we be erecting the same kinds of buildings in San Francisco that we've been erecting for the last 50 years? I don't have the answer to that question, but I'm very suspicious that we need to make some changes. So just a word about the current building code. Throughout history, the engineers have gotten together, and after most major earthquakes, they go out and look at what went wrong with various buildings, and they make a bunch of rules that say, don't do that again. Come up with some modification to the practice that will minimize the damage to buildings. So current building codes are mostly prescriptive rules based on building type and seismic zone. And the codes have been developed by fixing the deficiencies that people have seen in these past earthquakes. And I guess Kit was in Turkey looking at what went wrong in Turkey, so he can help to make recommendations about how to modify the building codes. If you've got a good building code, good engineers, you don't need seismologists or earth scientists, because you've seen all these different buildings in practice, and you've seen what makes them better. It's all about the buildings. But there's a different approach to the problem. It's called performance-based earthquake engineering. And this approach really became popular about turn of the millennium. And it's usually called PBEE, performance-based earthquake engineering, which says estimate the statistical model of the probability of shaking, and then build according to that statistical model of hazard. Oops, what happened? Oh, sorry, wrong button. So the current practice is to build so that the expected time between the collapse of structures that are done with PBEE is on the order of 2,500 years. That's what's typically used in Los Angeles. It seems that in San Francisco, it's actually 1,500 years. I'm not sure why it's shorter in San Francisco, except I think your lives are cheap. So, or you can strike that. Performance-based engineering is really only used in major projects. And the reason is because somebody has to do the statistical model, and there's a number of fairly expensive review parts to performance-based engineering. You have to get together a panel of experts to review the analysis and to make some recommendations. So So for smaller buildings, and they're mainly currently designed with the old prescriptive codes. Just a very quick overview. There's different kinds of buildings. On the one end of the scale are buildings that are very strong and stiff. And I've got a picture on the left here. If you look from the street level, everything's green. These would be typically solid walls. They could be solid walls of concrete. They could be solid walls of wood. Sometimes they're even steel walls, but mostly walls. And then, of course, floors and some openings. At the other, these buildings tend to be very strong. They're very hard to shear horizontally, but they also tend to be very stiff, and they tend to be very heavy because they've got a lot of material in the building. On the other end of the scale are frame buildings, which are primarily columns and beams and a lattice work, and the floors are, of course, on the beams. And those buildings are lighter and they're much more flexible if you shake them horizontally. And it turns out being flexible is a good thing, but these kinds of buildings tend to be weak, which is not a good thing. But it turns out you can't really build really tall buildings with this shear wall kinds of construction. That as they get too tall, the forces just get so great that eventually it doesn't matter how strong you build the building, it can't take the high forces in a tall building for a really stiff building. So people discovered it probably about the 1950s that the alternative was to make buildings flexible. And by making them flexible, it keeps the forces down in the building. But like I say, that can have some problems, and it shows up in winds. Wind can really get a really flexible building moving. There are ways to stiffen the building up, sort of a compromise between the two. You can put in some braces between the floors that stiffen up the building, and those are braced frame buildings. That's a tremendous oversimplification of the different kinds of buildings out there. So here's a really interesting figure of some shear wall, concrete shear wall buildings that were made in Japan. And the Japanese are very afraid of earthquakes. They've got 10 times as many earthquakes as we do. and a long history of earthquake disasters. And they're very careful about their earthquake engineering. This was the 1964 Niigata earthquake, magnitude 7-ish earthquake. And these are these concrete shear wall buildings. And you can see it actually shook pretty hard here, but these buildings, the ground liquefied under these buildings. It was built on a river delta. And the buildings basically at least some of them capsized. And that looks like a tremendous problem, which in a sense it was. But interestingly, what happened here? Interestingly, these buildings did not collapse, actually. People continued to live in these buildings even after the earthquake. They just used the windows for doors and doors for windows. And later, they even, I'm told, jacked these buildings back up to an erect state and continued to use them indefinitely. They're basically incredibly strong and indestructible in earthquakes.
Well, Thomas, that's the year I was born, but I know no one died in those buildings. That's the one thing I know. I didn't know that people actually live after that, though.
It's a pretty amazing story. Actually,
I can imagine.
And of course, architects hate these buildings because they're not very pretty. But anyway, so what's it doing? All right, so here's another example of three flexible buildings in the Mexico City earthquake. These were steel frame buildings, and they were three identical 20-story towers. They were actually 300 kilometers away from a magnitude 8 earthquake on the coast. And these resonated. And this building on the right, this steel building, when everything was over, no one could find any damage to that building. The building in the middle, if you hung a rope from the roof down to the ground, you'd find that the roof was permanently offset relative to the base by a meter, which was, it's too large to reoccupy the building, really. Once a steel building is built, there's almost no way to bend it back to be straight again. And the building on the left actually lost a column and collapsed horizontally. So these buildings were virtually identical in terms of their construction and design, but they had three completely different performances in this earthquake. And that just gives you some idea of how hard it is to actually predict what will happen to tall buildings in big earthquakes. So when we get a big earthquake, we're going to have one heck of a big experiment to figure out what's going on. So when someone goes to design buildings, they can go and build stiff buildings, or they can build flexible buildings. So usually it's the dilemma of, do I want to go flexible or do I want to build a strong building? It turns out that stiff buildings are strong, but they end up having high stresses when you shake them. So if you're going to make it stiff, you better make it strong. But if you make it strong, it's going to be stiffer, which means you're going to have to make it even stronger. So it's kind of a vicious circle. If you decide to make a building strong, you have to spend the money to make it very strong. If you make it flexible, which has been the trend for many years, it decreases the stresses in the building, but it also decreases the strength of the building, which is another kind of vicious circle in this thing. But people have to decide. As it turns out, for buildings taller than 10 stories, basically all buildings in anywhere tend to be made flexible, except that is in Chile. Chileans somehow never got the message about flexible buildings, and they make their tall buildings very stiff. there's big debate about that. I'm not sure how that's going to turn out. So there's really only one building code in the US. It's published in a book, and but it turns out when you go to use the building code, when you have to make a decision at the beginning, am I going to make my building flexible or am I going to make my building stiff and strong? And once you make that decision, the building code looks like it bifurcates. It looks very different for those two different kinds of buildings. So just to give you an example of what short period and long period looks like, I'm going to show you a really interesting example from Mexico. This is the Cucapa El Mayor earthquake in 2010, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake on this strike slip fault just south of our border. And here's the city of Mexicali. And here's the recording of the ground motion in Mexicali. This is acceleration. There was actually a magnitude 6 foreshock, and this high frequency is from the magnitude 6. And then there was a 7 main shock about 15 seconds later. And usually people's eyes are drawn to this rapid high frequency peak acceleration, but you'll see later in the record are these kind of longer period waves coming in. And I'm going to show you what this looks like. So again, here's a satellite view. The fault is here. Mexicali is a city of 1 million people. These are not wealthy people. And it's right next to this big earthquake. When I heard what happened here, I thought, oh my God, this is going to be a horrible disaster. As it turned out, there were only 2 fatalities in this earthquake, even though it shook pretty hard in Mexicali. And part of the reason there were only 2 fatalities is because the Mexican citizens had been taught how to build concrete block structures. They're very much built the way you build a 7-Eleven store. They're a concrete block with the cells are filled with concrete and also have steel reinforcing in them. They're easy to build, they're not expensive, and it turns out they're indestructible in earthquakes. So they really lucked out. Here's a video of that earthquake shaking in Cucapa El Mayor. And this is a camera that's on top of a steel pole. It's just a surveillance camera. And oops, I just spoiled anyway. Here's the beginning of the shaking. Here's that foreshock and the high frequency that's shaking around the camera on the pole. And it would have been exciting to sit on this pole, but it's very high frequency. And you can see in the background, the 8-story stiff building, I think that's a wooden building, is not affected by this high frequency shaking. So we're looking at the high frequency part of the shaking. And in a second, we'll get to the longer period part of the shaking, and you can get some idea of what that long period looks like. And it starts right about now. And so this is probably about 4-second period and a very different kind of shaking. And that's the kind of shaking that's dangerous to tall buildings. And so my next point is that architects are really often not thinking about earthquakes. This is not what wins awards. This is actually out of Singapore. They hardly ever have earthquakes in Singapore. I never heard of one, but this architect obviously wasn't thinking about earthquakes. And here's another interesting architectural building. This is from Seattle. This was built in 1977. And if you look at the base of this building, you can see this building tapers down and it's much narrower at the base than at the top of the building. And the engineers who designed this building made it work according to the codes. I mean, it's actually got quite a stiff, strong core in this building, and the rest of the building is just cantilevered out from it. You can make it work structurally, but obviously, if you were really worried about earthquakes, it'd be easier if you didn't make the footpad of the building narrower than the top. So people do crazy things sometimes. So just to explain how a frame building actually works. A frame building, they can be made out of steel columns and beams. They can be made out of concrete columns and beams. And these days, there are even cases where people make them out of wood. But whatever, a frame building is just a set of columns and connected beams in a lattice work horizontally. And these connections, it turns out, are very important in this kind of structure. If you made this building with connections that were a bunch of hinges, when the building shook sideways, there would be no deformation of the beams. Everything would be in the columns, and the columns, if you made it tall, it would be very easy to collapse the building. But instead, there are connections, very strong connections between the beams and the columns. And it's important that the beams and the columns remain perpendicular to each other, because when that happens, it puts a flexure in the beams. And those beams, when you flex them, it's a kind of spring, and that's the restoring force spring to bring the building back to vertical. And it's important that the welds that can, or any of the parts of the connection here, are strong enough to hold the forces in that flexure of the beam. So,
Doctor, can I ask you a question about that? Supposedly we have 39 buildings in San Francisco with weak welds. If you were on the ground floor of one of those buildings and you knew it had the weak welds, would you, and a big earthquake hit, would you be inclined to stay in the building or run out?
I think I'd be praying. I
Can
don't know the answer to that. Honestly, I don't. I'd be panicking. They tell you don't panic in earthquakes.
Let me try to field that one if you don't mind, Tom.
Please, yes.
In a big earthquake, you want to drop, cover, and hold. Do not try to run anywhere. You try to run out of the building, you're probably going to be thrown to the ground and injured by the strength of the shaking. You're not going to be able to get out of the building. So just drop, cover, and hold on.
I completely
excellent,
agree,
excellent answer. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I saw the people who died in 2017 Mexico earthquake. It's one of the cities in City Hall. People run out. They just died by a falling object, and the building didn't collapse. Yeah, I'll definitely stay in there for sure.
The consensus among the Red Cross, the Earthquake Country Alliance, the U.S. Geological Survey, everyone who thinks about this is what you do in a U.S. earthquake is you drop, cover, and hold on. Don't pay any attention to triangles of life, and don't run out of the building. Don't do anything except practice drop, cover, and hold on every year, and do it when the earthquake comes.
What Keith is correct about U.S. buildings. Some countries are definitely going to run down, by the way.
All right,
sure.
So let's get back to these welds. So here's a photograph of a frame building. It's steel frame, and the connections, these corners between the beams and the columns are welded connections. They used to be made when people first started these types of buildings with rivets, and then they went to bolts, and then starting in the 50s, they started welding these connections. These welds are what are called full penetration welds, and they weld the flange of the beam to the flange of the column. And this is called a moment resisting connection.
Sorry to interrupt again, Tom. Don't steal my thunder too much. All of my talk is going to be about these guys.
The welds, really?
The pre-Northridge welded steel moment frame buildings.
Okay. Let's see. Well, jump in. This is a photograph of a test done by one of my colleagues at UC San Diego, showing what you'd like to happen at these connections between beams and columns. This connection was designed after people saw problems in the Northridge earthquake, and it's an extremely robust connection. And so when you test this building test this connection by putting a force on the beam actually begins to bend. We call it plastic bending, and which means that the steel is kind of bent like you'd bend a coat hanger or something like that. You can see the bent steel here. People call this a plastic hinge, and that's the desired behavior of these frame buildings. You can have bending of the beams. You don't want bending of the columns because the columns carry the gravitational load of the building. So this is what you'd like to see happen in a building. But here's a test of what those connections look like. Oops, let me get back to it. In real life, again, from the same guy, Cha-Ming Wang at UC San Diego. So here's a steel column connected to a very strong concrete wall, hydraulic piston forcing the beam up and down, and it's welded. I'll show you in a second. So here's the piston going up and down. Here's the column, and the connected welds are right here and here. There's one on the top and one on the bottom, and it's increasing the load. And you'd like to see bending in this beam, but instead what you see is that weld just fractured. And people were shocked to see that in this earthquake. And after this was showed up in the Northridge earthquake and also in the Kobe earthquake in Japan. Japan had the same problem. Here it is close up.
Doctor, I think Kit has to leave. Why don't we give you a break?
Okay.
A few minutes and then perhaps come back to you. Kit, do you want to share what you've learned in Turkey?
Yeah, sure. I can do really quickly and some key pointers there. Okay, let me see here. Okay. Past 20 years, essentially, I've been living in disaster zones, from Turkey to New Zealand to Japan to Haiti. That's all those places I'm living there. One of my interesting things, Professor Heaton talked about this so-called probability of things happening, right? When we engineer the buildings, we design based on the statistics. But it seems the statistics actually really happening out there doesn't want to follow the statistics to me. Every single earthquake, I've been around for the last 20 years, no exceptions. Some area of a city or region which are affected by, always exceeding the so-called maximum capable earthquake kind of stuff, which means that what Professor Heaton is talking about, once in a 25-year earthquake things, it's always comments by engineers, oh, we need to change the building code because this is such a huge earthquake. That's why it's collapsed so many buildings. Just always same thing, always like that. So it's designed for some certain statistics. I guess that's one way to look at them because you have to design some baselines. But just solely relying on, oh, this is going to happen only once in 25 years, so this is okay to collapse. It's just not a really right way to doing it. I think that's a really, really important lessons there. 97.8 and the 7.5 happened back to back in the early morning on February 6th in Turkey, southern Turkey. It's affected almost 15 million people, about 250 to about 400,000 building stocks. Many are modern high-rise constructions out there, by the way. killed about 50,000 people. 50,000 people in about 60 seconds. Destroyed the, initially collapsed about 10,000 buildings and damaged about somewhere between 100,000 to 200,000 building stocks up there. And Turkish building code, what is happening here? Turkish building code is actually similar to what we use in California, by the way. It's not much difference. And their engineering education is fantastic. Actually, it's one of the best engineers you see come from Turkey, by the way, you know. And Turkey has been investing in the earthquake thing since 1999, billions of dollars for this disaster risk reduction concept that they're doing now. Why it's failed? Well, it's actually pretty simple. A couple reasons. One is anything built prior to about year 2000, that's a benchmark building code changed. There's no seismic considerations. So it's really dangerous. What we call non-ductile concrete structures. That's something that the Professor Heaton showed you at the pre-Northridge connections. Those are non-ductile connections. It's dangerous. Ton of those there. And if you got the magnitude 7.8 and 7.5 happens to back, there's no chance on that. Especially that those buildings many sits on the soft soil. I mean, some of the towns I went, you're talking about collapse ratio exceeding probably like 80%. 80%. I mean, look like a nuclear bomb exploded. You know? So that's the one reason, older building stocks. In the California benchmark here is 1973 for concrete structures. So anything built, any kind of concrete structures built prior to 1973 without seismic strength, if the magnitude is 7.8, 7.5 happens back, there's no chance. There's no doubt about it. Okay. Pre-Northridge connections, steel construction, 1994. Yeah, they're pretty dangerous. You saw the testing that Professor Heaton showed. You can see like that. Now, and also that the second thing is the building code. So we designed for this, you know, once in 500-year earthquake or once in 25-year earthquake, which is kind of meaningless to me, by the way, but it's kind of designed for some certain benchmark. And we do really reckless things, by the way, especially high-rise buildings, new construction. We allow to actually, it's name of performance-based engineering. It's essentially reduces some of the code requirements. Used to be, you have to have a dual systems, like moment frames or shear walls and combination of things like that. Not today. You can design it to 500 feet high, 50-story buildings with only concrete core walls, without nothing else. And it allowed to permanently displace up to 1% of a story height, which means 1 foot every 100 feet. So typical 550-story building, 500 feet high, 1% is 5 feet, permanent displacement. That's what we engineer today. Is it gonna collapse? Probably not. Buildings are hard to collapse, by the way, if it's done right. You know, many of the modern construction I saw in Turkey, everything else completely gone, but if it's done right, you don't see much damages there. You know, by the way, but well, damages, but it may not be occupable. That's the whole thing is, you know. 2011 Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand. Again, it's a Christchurch in New Zealand in the building code and everything else is same as we are, you know, same kind of cities they build up there. It was a March 11th event. It's magnitude 6.3 or something like that, but a very shallow, you know, event at the right in downtown Christchurch. It's about 180 people died, town about 350,000, 400,000 people. So in a sense, kind of about be able to protect the lives, which it happens, right? Didn't kill like 1,000 people. That's a met intent of a building code. But out of about 2,400 building stocks, about 2,000 of them get damaged and they're gone, you know, not able to repairable, not able to live again. That's the kind of things happening here. So that's the exact same building code. So I think one of the things we should really keenly aware is the old building stock. That's a really dangerous. I think seismic strength is very important. And two is that just following a minimum building code requirement is not good enough For example, in the US, we allowed to make the building to move, not only permanently displace 1%, but able to move 2% going back and forth, during the big earthquake shaking for tall buildings. Professor Heaton talked about Japanese building code, allowed to have 1% displacement. So which means twice less. And how they actually deal with that, they use the energy dissipators, damping devices. Professor Heaton talked about either strength or flexibility, but there's actually a third way, which is adding damping devices in the structural systems, and which is available, which actually be able to reduce the displacement. So that's what Japanese deal with, use that kind of system like that to meet the more strict building code requirement than we have. So I think that it's really important thing is that we to realize that actually we have options when we engineer the buildings. We can actually engineer buildings for the higher performance, and which probably not add much more cost, by the way, for the new construction, probably a few percentage at the tops. I think that's really critical. And appreciation of the seismic strengthening of the older construction. Why did, some of the questions, Dave, you're asking about why only a few buildings be seismically strengthening in San Francisco or anywhere that's true? Because can't afford it, that's why. It costs about 10 to 15% of a replacement cost to do seismic strengthening to the modern criteria, which doesn't seem much, right? But in the US, it does not add much of a market value to it. It's not like a building owners have a whole bunch of money sits in there to do this, right? To do that, even spend 10% of a replacement cost, you have to finance, you have to borrow the money. But if the building value doesn't go up, appreciated, how are you gonna borrow the money? You know what I mean? So there's a dilemma about it. It's all coming down to demand and supply. I think if the public demands, publicly sees the seismic strengthening, actually that it makes sense for the, for the commercially, and that will definitely cause the flood of a seismic strengthening. And but unfortunately, things like that only happens after the major earthquake. It's always like that, like a Turkey. Yeah, after losing 50,000 people, they'll be very strict about the inspection and look into the older buildings and stuff like that. So, yeah, and some people talk about, we went through 1989 Loma Prieta, we went through that 1994 Northridge. You go, okay, well, those are moderate earthquakes, it's magnitude 6.8, 6.9, that kind of things. You're talking magnitude 7.8, like thousands times more energy in there. So that type of things that we have to kind of think about it. Last true urban disaster, Californians we experienced was 1906. That's not the true urban disaster. We haven't seen anything yet, which we will see, by the way.
So the short-term investment ownership of these buildings, out-of-town owners come in, turn them around after a couple of years and leave, is really not very conducive to retrofitting. And
Exactly.
I think Kit's point is a really important one. I work at Caltech campus, which Keith has been there, and our buildings are mostly very much like those Japanese concrete shear wall buildings. And they've been built that way since the 1930s, really. And when I asked the earthquake engineers at Caltech why they built those kinds of buildings, they didn't know what they were doing. They just said that building would work for Caltech, and I knew it was a really robust style of building. And George Hausner, who was a very famous earthquake engineer, always told me, he said, I kind of knew what I didn't know. And I think a really important point. He built for things that he understood he didn't know. And later, when people built really more daring buildings, they had to make assumptions about what the ground would move like, even though they didn't really know what those motions were.
Professor Heaton, I completely agree. I mean, we over rely on some kind of a science kind of thing. We feel like we know everything, right? I mean, we just say we're going to afford building code or performance-based engineering building code. We say a statement like this is going to happen this way. But nature is not like that. Nature is very random. It's more like a bell curve. Some do perform like we said it's going to be. Some perform better. Some perform much worse. You know.
Well, I argue it's more like a Pareto curve, which is a horrible kind of curve. Keith knows about those.
Okay.
They're
Keith,
very
you wanna
difficult to
jump
deal
in?
with.
Keith, do you want to jump in?
About bell curves and Pareto curves? No, I don't think anybody besides Tom, Kit, and I are interested in Pareto curves. But I'm happy, you know, whenever Kit's yeah, I'll wait until Kit concludes to.
Oh no,
Everybody's welcome.
I'm done. I think I made it enough talk about what I saw out there and what kind of things we need to do. But one thing though, I think that we need to create a commercial environment where the investment become easier, right? I think David, you got a good point. How the invest? See, like for example, we have this our headquarters in LA. It's in high-rise buildings. It's a pre-Northridge moment frame connection, by the way, in there. We're at the 51st level. One day we approach the ownership group, we're kind of structural engineers, and we can just have an strength with this building, no cost, I don't know, not much, $5 million, and we figured that they can get the money back in like 6 months time, actually, for such a big building, right? They kind of thought about it a little bit.
Thing to retrofit a high rise after it's built. It's very expensive, and it's not obvious that it will be effective. It's not easy to do. It's so much easier to just build shorter buildings. Frankly.
Okay, but we need office building. So anyway, seismic strengthening at
Do
5
we?
mil, whatever it is. But problem is that they said no, thank you, because of it does not add any values to it. They rather spend at the same amount of money to make a building prettier, lobbies prettier, and that's exactly what they did actually. You know what I mean? So there's no action from there. Structurally, architecturally beautiful now, but it's same pre-Northridge moment connections there. Anyway, that's it.
Dr. Porter, do you know how we compare with other cities that have required retrofitting of the weak steel frames? I understand one city in LA has given their buildings 20 years to repair the steel frames. We haven't even started the 20-year clock. How far behind are we?
Well, the way I'd calculate it is since 1995. I mean, we've known about the problem, we've known about the solution for almost 30 years. And we're just sitting on our hands and not solving the problem. Do you want me to give my presentation, or just want to have a conversation? What do you prefer?
Well, we want to know what we should be doing. So that's the science of earthquakes is probably going to be over our heads. But
I'm not going to talk about the science of earthquakes. I'm going to talk about this particular the kind of building that Tom kind of touched on, and the liability that is attached to those. I want to sort of go into more detail about what those buildings are, what we know about them, how long we've known about them. So if I may, the building type that Tom referred to, these steel moment frames, they're not the only problematic building type in California. There's a few others that are far more vulnerable than the rest of the building stock. But I want to talk in particular about those ones because they're of particular interest to me. And if my talk is of any interest to the participants, you'll find a paper that you can download for free from the American Bar Association that I'm going to be speaking from. So anyhow, Tom explained what a steel moment frame is. It's a building with beams and columns, where the beams and the columns are connected rigidly together at the joints. And between about 1960 and about 1994, we built this particular kind of steel moment frame building with a weld that turned out to be a lot more brittle than we thought it was going to be. It was supposed to be stronger than the adjacent beam, and it turned out to be no more strong than the adjacent beam, and in some cases actually weaker. And that leads to a building that is about 1/10 as strong as we thought it was going to be. Those brittle welds mean that you don't get to deform the steel like the coat hanger that Tom talked about. The weld fractures suddenly, and a lot of these welds can fracture suddenly. And that can lead to the collapse of high-rise steel frame buildings. We've known about this actually since before 1994. There were tests that performed in 1988 at UC Berkeley that raised questions about these welds. There have been plenty after the 1994 Northridge earthquake. However, there were a lot of FEMA studies performed with FEMA funding by practicing engineers, by university professors, by a big consortium of structural engineers to understand the problem and to design solutions for this kind of building. But what they found was that these buildings are so vulnerable that it is realistic that in a large but not extremely large earthquake, like the shakeout event of Southern California, magnitude 7.8 earthquake in on the southern San Andreas Fault in LA, anywhere from 1 to 10 of these buildings could collapse. Each one would kill 1,000 people. And perhaps as worrying as the collapses is the fact that for every one of those collapses, something on the order of 10 of those buildings would be red tagged, meaning that they would not be safe to enter and occupy. And that means that everybody in those buildings would have to leave the building for months while the building is repaired or demolished. And even more worrying is the fact that all the buildings within one collapse radius of that red tag building would also have to be evacuated. So picture all of the high-rise buildings in San Francisco that were built between 1960 and 1994. Almost every one of those, perhaps every one of those, is of this type. And picture 10 of them red tagged. That means that 10 city blocks or more would also have to be red tagged. So without even collapsing, these buildings would force the evacuation of hundreds or thousands of nearby buildings and businesses. We know how to identify these buildings. It's not that hard. There are structural drawings on file at the building department. The design documents show very clearly whether this is or is not this type of building. And furthermore, every time one of these buildings is bought or sold, which happens every 5 or 10 years or so, there's a study done on it called a due diligence study that would tell the buyer, oh, this is a pre-Northridge welded steel moment frame building. It has these brittle welds. So the welds are the problem, but there's more to it than just the welds. There's the chemistry of the weld and the geometry of the weld, and there's also the strength of the shaking and the duration of shaking, as Tom has alluded to. All these things go into determining whether the building collapses or not, whether the building is red tagged or not. So there's a lot of variables involved, but the thing to remember is that in a bunch of studies have concluded that in a not very rare earthquake, it is conceivable that many of these buildings would collapse, or several would collapse, and many would be red tagged. And we have in California hundreds, maybe thousands of these buildings. There are 740 10 or higher story buildings in California that are probably of this type. And we know that from a database of high-rise buildings. We don't have a similar database of buildings that are shorter than 10 stories, but there are probably many times as many shorter steel moment frame buildings of that era. So there may be thousands of buildings of this type. So this is not a question of uncertainty. It's not a question of limited information. It's not a question of disagreement there's no disagreement among structural engineers that these are problem buildings. There's no mystery about them. None of this information has been hidden, and it's all been well known for almost 30 years. And Kit alluded several times to the 2,500 year shaking, and it's that is a problem. The way we structural engineers talk about rare earthquake shaking as if it's never going to happen, or we can wait 2,400 more years before it happens. But the fact is that there are many, even at lower levels of shaking, these buildings have a chance of collapse. It's not as if up to 2,500 year shaking, it doesn't collapse, and then one little increment beyond that, it does. There's just a lower probability at lower level of shaking and a higher probability at higher levels of shaking. As a matter of fact, there is a more than 50% chance of a magnitude 7 earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area in the next 30 years. And one of those earthquakes is capable of collapsing one of these high-rise steel frame buildings. California isn't alone in having this problem. These buildings exist across the West Coast. It's hard to be unaware of the problem. There was a New York Times article. There are these PML studies. The owners of these buildings know that they own these buildings. That is, and if they pretend not to know, or if they have been so careless as not to know, the law is not going to exempt them from not knowing. They should know, and it is not hard to know. But nonetheless, nothing's been done about these buildings, at least in the San Francisco Bay Area, for 30 years. And the reason is that it's so costly to fix them. The cost 20 years ago was for each one of those connections, each place where a beam connects to a column, fixing that costs about, 20 years ago, fixing it cost about $25,000. Now it's more like $50,000, and there can be hundreds of connections like that in each building. So we're talking for a typical high-rise steel frame building in San Francisco, more than $10 million to do the retrofit. I disagree slightly with Tom about whether the retrofit would be effective. I tend to believe the practicing and the scholar and the research structural engineers who say, no, this is how you fix it. It's costly, but we can replace the brittle weld with a much more rugged connection. So we're not fixing those buildings because it's so costly, because building codes do not act retroactively. Once the building is finished and it passes the code and it's permitted to that you can go and occupy it, it's very rare that anybody says, no, you have to get out and fix it. It does happen, but it doesn't happen very often, and it hasn't happened in San Francisco. Another reason why so little has been done about this is that nobody owns the problem. The owners are not required to retrofit because the code isn't retroactive. FEMA doesn't make them retrofit because FEMA doesn't have any authority to force people to do retrofit. Engineers don't have the authority to tell building owners, and we're not inclined to tell building owners to do the retrofit because we are beholden to the building owners. They're the ones who pay us our design fees. They're the ones who butter our bread. So we don't rush around waving flags and saying, fix these buildings, fix these buildings. An assemblyman from Southern California tried to get a bill passed to mandate the inventory, just the counting of all these buildings. And in his last month or so in office, Governor Brown vetoed that bill because of the cost. So there are all these dangerous buildings out there. There's a potential for enormous civil liability because of them. Just because the code does not require retroactive repair of these buildings, that doesn't mean that the owners are off the hook. Tort law holds that a foreseeable risk If the preponderance of evidence tells you that the owner of the building should have been able to foresee harm to the tenant, to passersby, etc., they are, and that harm could lead to injury, that they are going to be, they can be held responsible for that injury. As a matter of fact, landlords and anyone who invites other people into those buildings can be asked, you know, why didn't you do anything about this? Why did you invite people into the building that you knew or should have known was dangerous? This isn't just my opinion. The article that I shared with you was written by me and a colleague. I wrote the engineering bits. My colleague is a lawyer, and he wrote the tort liability bits. But it's not just me and a lawyer. The Association of Bay Area Governments also found that developers may be liable for earthquake damage and injuries under implied warranty or strict liability laws. So this is not even all that controversial an idea that when one of these big earthquakes comes along, and if it causes collapse or causes red tagging, people are going to be held legally responsible. Owners who are delaying remediation, they are externalizing risk onto their tenants, the future owners, passersby, and onto the owners and tenants of nearby buildings, and they can be held responsible. As a matter of fact, the architects, the engineers, anybody involved in the decisions about whether or not to repair these buildings might have to face a jury someday if they are still alive when this earthquake comes along. And as I alluded to before, that is not all that unlikely a possibility in our professional lives. Now, government exists fundamentally to protect us from harming each other. And the courts exist for the purpose of holding people responsible who harm other people. When businesses, employers, engineers, architects fail in our duty to provide safe places, we and all those decision makers who are involved in failing to protect may be held responsible under law. Now, I want to reach a conclusion here. As I said, there's many other vulnerable building types. These ones are particularly problematic because they don't just threaten the tenants of the buildings themselves, but they threaten hundreds or thousands of buildings and businesses and people around them who have nothing to do with the dangerous building, no power to compel anybody to fix anything, and no responsibility to know that the building next door is a danger to them. These buildings are far more dangerous than we thought they were when we designed them, and we have known that for 30 years now. We have already lost 30 years to dithering about whether we should mandate the remediation of these buildings, and aside from the city of LA, no one is making any progress on fixing this problem. That the earthquake that is going to damage these buildings is coming. It is not in the distant future. As I said, more than 50% chance that something like this could happen in the next 30 years. Many, and in any case, many or most of these buildings are going to be here for centuries. They are going to be here when, not if, a big earthquake comes. They're not going to be fixed unless we take some action. So with that, I'll conclude.
I understand that there actually are requirements when a building is largely, what's the word, repurposed?
Renovated, yeah.
Yeah, I can't cite the code. Maybe Laurel knows or John, but there's a lot of talk here about converting from commercial to residential, which would certainly be that kind of renovating, but they're also talking about loosening rules. So the fear is that they might decide, well, we don't need to retrofit anymore. Laurel, do you know, is that actually a hard and fast requirement that?
Oh, Sorry, I thought you were asking me if they were waiving seismic requirements, which I have not heard that they are. Just wanted to make that clear. I have not heard from anyone that they're planning to waive seismic requirements on residential conversions. If they are, it's unbeknownst to me.
Good.
And I actually had a question for Keith. So your specialty is steel moment frame buildings, just for the good, the good of the general audience. What are the types of buildings you alluded to at the beginning that are known to be more common and more dangerous?
Well, I'm not a specialist in this particular kind of building. I'm an earthquake engineer. I'm a structural engineer. My specialty is in the design and evaluation and remediation of buildings subject to all kinds of earthquake forces. And as a matter of fact, I have some expertise in other kinds of disasters as well. But to answer your question, some of the other really vulnerable building types are unreinforced masonry bearing wall buildings. You remember all those brick buildings that have been retrofitted around San Francisco since since just after the Loma Prieta earthquake. Those are probably the most dangerous building type, but there are several others. Older concrete buildings where we reinforce concrete buildings with beams and columns. The steel inside them is too far apart, and when they crack, when they get shaken in an earthquake, the concrete inside cracks, and because the bars are too far apart, the concrete can come out and the building can collapse. That's another time.
Those are real killers. Those are responsible for most of the deaths in Turkey.
That's right.
And so, like things that happened in Mexico City, there have been many deaths from those types of buildings.
That's correct.
And Dr. Miyamoto, you mentioned that you'd lived in so many disaster areas. I'm just curious, in all your experience, maybe this is a question for Dr. Porter too. How does San Francisco's building code compare to the rest of the world? You mentioned that you would stay in a building if you were in the US, but you might run out of the building if you were in another country. I'm just curious, in all of your experience, where San Francisco sits, since this is a San Francisco neighborhood group.
San Francisco, one of the best cities there, as far as the engine technology is concerned. Okay, but obviously, we have great engineers and education system, license system, and a very being department of inspection process and approval process, bar none, probably best in the world. But even new construction, I think that there's a disconnect, I do believe, what we engineering versus what society is expecting. I think that I see this everywhere. Society see as when engineer like me engineer buildings, think it's a earthquake proof. Obviously no collapse, but also be able to use with a new construction. That's what the people like to believe, but it's not. It's all those buildings designed for what we call life safety. So which means there's going to be major damage going to happen to those high-rise buildings. Hopefully no one died. That's the design philosophy like that. So that's how we are building cities today, by the way, but that's pretty common throughout the world. Exception in Japan, though, I think a lot to do with it. They do go through a lot of earthquakes, and they see that the high technology really safe to make the buildings perform better than minimum building code per se. So Japanese, market is much easier. People willing to pay the better engineered or high performance engine buildings. Not in the case in California, though. You know what I mean? So that value system, I think it's not about that low, it's not about code, it's about public, it's about us, about we demand to have the better buildings, we're willing to pay. I think that's the key there to make changes.
Well, it all starts with an architect. In the beginning, an architect says, I have this bold new design for a building. It's going to have lots of windows. It's going to have lots of open space for people. And so the architect says, I've got this really cool idea. And they're not thinking about earthquakes when they come up with that cool idea. And somebody says, well, what about earthquakes? And they say, well, it'll be built to the code. The earthquake engineers will take care of it, which is true. The earthquake engineers, there will be earthquake engineers that will take that job and we'll design that building. But it probably, we could be a very different society if people got together and said that kind of really open, airy type of building is inevitably going to be a problem in earthquakes. We're going to have to work really hard to make that kind of design work. And it'll be an experiment when we finally try it.
Well, I think that we do have really rugged buildings. There's a building on the Caltech campus with a particular kind of brace.
Yes,
It's a
typical
steel.
Caltech, we build way beyond.
Yeah, but with that particular kind of brace, that building will remain almost undamaged at design level shaking.
Keith and I are on the same wavelength there. This is the building that Keith is talking about, does have an open design, but it's got some elements. It's still only a 3-story building, and it has some elements that makes it act as if it was a concrete shear wall building. And so Caltech has traditionally been a place that is willing to admit we don't know what earthquakes really can do. Let's just make really good buildings. And we've ended up with a campus that we don't think we need to retrofit, which is a real blessing. Unfortunately, today, even new buildings going up at Caltech, the architects are telling the people, you don't need all that stuff. I mean, you're overbuilding above the code. I can make a much more pleasant architectural design than what you're currently using at Caltech. I'm retired now, so I can't stop them. So,
Professor Heaton, I'm not 100% sure if I agree with the comments. Is that the architects want the responsibility, though? I mean,
they're part of the whole system. I mean, if the architects and the engineers are really, and the earth scientists are all really communicating, I think we'll have a different set of buildings.
I think engineers, we're the experts, right? I'm a structural engineer.
Totally.
I'm responsible. I'm the responsible to basically inform the architects for options, not only architects, but the owners, about developers, about, banks, about those options available.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really critical piece. And
Yeah.
yes, it's
Let me
code-wise, you can afford the minimum code, but there's something you can do to make it better, building system.
Let me be totally clear about this. If you went to university and you looked at the people in your university who were the smartest and hardest working people at your university, they were probably the engineers in your university. These are people that have dedicated their lives to making our society work better. These are really the creme de la creme of our society. But still, we're find ourselves in this position where we're looking back at things and saying, we seem to have made some mistakes in decisions somewhere. And I think we need to look at the entire system to decide how we got in this place in the first place. Because this is not because people are greedy or crooked, at least not from the engineering point of view.
Dave, I think it might be time to take some questions from the audience.
Would anyone like to hear what the city is doing on it, or should we pause for questions for the PhDs first?
Let's hear from Laurel first and then go to questions.
Okay, I can run through my presentation really quickly. Thank you for having us here. Really appreciate it. And just really quickly, because I know that most of us are not engineers. I'm not an engineer either. I know that talking about this the way that engineers do can be scary, especially because a lot of us live in tall buildings. Oh, it looks like can anyone see my screen?
No.
No.
Oh, yeah.
Oh no, it's not working. Okay. Well, my name is Laurel Mathews. I work for San Francisco's Office of Resilience and Capital Planning.
There it is.
There it is. Okay, let me put it on the screen. It's my big screen. That's the problem. Oop. We are under the Office of Capital Planning, but we also work across departments. So we work on our hazards and climate resilience plan, community action plan for seismic safety. And so I'm a policy person. I'm not an engineer. I listen to what the engineers identify as the biggest risks and do my best to take action in a way that makes sense for San Francisco. San Francisco's guiding policy document when it comes to seismic safety is the Community Action Plan for Seismic Safety. This was a document that came out of the Loma Prieta earthquake. It took a long time to finalize and get funding for and community buy-in for, but the reason I asked Dr. Porter about these more dangerous and more common building types is because San Francisco is rare on the West Coast and that we've already addressed some of them. So back in the 90s, we required retrofits for unreinforced masonry buildings. More recently, from 2013 through about 2021, we had a mandatory retrofit program for wood frame soft story buildings. Private schools are interesting in San Francisco because public schools are overseen by the state, but private schools don't have special state oversight when it comes to seismic safety. So we required a seismic evaluation of all of our private schools. We have recently passed this facade inspection and maintenance ordinance. And what I'm working on is a retrofit ordinance for older concrete buildings, or in what I believe Dr. Miyamoto referred to non-ductile concrete buildings. San Francisco has a retrofit ordinance for those in the works. I'm not going to go through all of my slides. I'll say that our soft story program, the slide's a little bit out of date. We have 90% compliance at this point, which is great, because in Loma Prieta, which, as the folks on this call know, is not the biggest type of earthquake San Francisco is at risk for, but we are at risk for similar earthquakes to that happening again in the future. Soft story was really one of our big problems. So it's great that we've retrofitted those. The concrete building safety program, which is what's in development now, our goal is to identify, evaluate, and retrofit the most vulnerable older concrete, non-ductile concrete, and then also concrete tilt-up. I think that's less relevant to this discussion, so I won't go into what tilt-ups, aka ridge wall flexible diaphragm is, but we're working on non-ductile concrete. I think that we've talked like from an engineering perspective about what non-ductile concrete is. It's different from welded steel moment frame. It's buildings that are too rigid, too brittle. It's been responsible for some of the most deadly collapses in cities like New Zealand and Mexico City. So it's really important, high on our priority list to get these buildings strengthened. Los Angeles, Santa Monica, and West Hollywood have already enacted ordinances for this type of building. But it's really complex enacting an ordinance. As someone alluded to earlier, it's hard to retrofit existing buildings. Buildings that have been built, we don't no longer have a review process. We're not looking at the plans, and it's not hypothetical. These are real buildings that people work and live in. And so developing retrofit program for them is pretty challenging. To do this for non-ductile concrete, we've convened an executive panel of the city administrator, director of building inspection, director of emergency management, director of the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, city assessor, public works, and then the mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development. We also have a stakeholder working group of about 35 stakeholder representatives. Their role is to represent the concerns of stakeholders, including vulnerable communities, provide recommendations for program policy and design, and ensure our program products are usable. And the stakeholder working group is meeting for about a year, ending at the end of this year. So we're about halfway done. Also relevant to this group, this is a little bit outside of the Earthquake Safety Implementation Program CAP. San Francisco commissioned a study of our tall buildings. Specifically, this is just a report that says, hey, we live in a city of seismic risk. We have tall buildings. What are the biggest risks there? What are the recommendations to become safer? And this report makes 15 recommendations. It's everything. I'll go back from building code requirement recommendations to policies and practices, assessment of retrofit of certain types of existing buildings, and post-earthquake inspection and response. These recommendations fall into a couple different categories, from reducing risk prior to earthquakes. And the one of this that we did almost immediately, in part because of Millennium Tower, was improve how we process geotechnical review of tall buildings. There are recommendations related to reducing risk prior to earthquakes. We're working on some of these now. As Mr. Osgood mentioned, we haven't passed a retrofit ordinance related to steel moment frame buildings, but we do have a contract. The contract we have to develop the non-ductile concrete program also includes a potential scope, once the concrete program is in place, to explore steel moment frame buildings. So it's a possibility. It's not currently underway. There are recommendations related to post-earthquake safety inspection. This is really hard for tall buildings. As some of the prior, as Dr. Miyamoto and Dr. Porter mentioned, most of these buildings are unlikely to collapse, but they'll be pretty damaged, right? After a really, really, really large earthquake. And the state's existing program for inspecting buildings after an earthquake is amazing, but it doesn't apply super well to tall buildings. So San Francisco, we have some programs to address this. We have a program called the Building Occupancy Resumption Program, but it can be updated and tightened up. And this Tall Buildings report makes a lot of recommendations around that. And then finally, just improving the understanding of our tall buildings risk. Mr. Osgood mentioned at the beginning of this that we have a database of tall buildings. For the sake of scope and just not having enough bandwidth to look at every single tall building in the city, we defined tall building as above 240 feet. But we'd really like to, at some point, expand that database and compile all those fields of data for a wider range of buildings. And one thing I want to address, one of Mr. Osgood's questions was, why are there different standards for buildings above 240 feet versus below? There are not. That was a cutoff we used for the inventory of tall buildings, but those buildings are not subject to different standards than shorter buildings. And I think this is it. I can mention we have a council. One of the things that we work on is coordinating with public and private providers of lifelines and infrastructure providers. So we meet quarterly with PG&E, SFPUC, who I believe is or was on this call, transit systems, airport, fuel, and coordinate on issues about how we would come back online after an earthquake, because maybe it's hard to get water if your electricity is cut out. These systems rely on one another. And I apologize. I think I talked through more of my slides than I thought, but that is my presentation. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you.
Any comments about the, from anyone about the MAT foundations? Again, I think we have 44, 43 that are essentially the same type as the Millennium Building, but no pilings under them. What should we do?
You want the panelists to answer that first?
Please.
Is this a question for me? So no one on this panel is a geotechnical engineer, as far as I understand. I think it might be worth convening a follow-up panel to talk about geotechnical issues specifically. I don't know if the structural engineers agree. I'm happy to hear other perspectives.
Yeah, I think getting a specialist to answer the question is a good idea. I know enough about geotechnical earthquake engineering to know what the geotechs are saying and to be dangerous, to be willing to answer this question, but it'd be better to talk to a real expert.
Would you work in one of those buildings?
After talking to one of the experts.
Look at the Millennium Tower. I mean, it's a modern building. There wasn't going to be a problem. Then there was a problem. And so they came up with a fix. The fix made it worse. And now they've come up with fix number 2, and maybe it'll work. Nobody's ever seen it in a large earthquake to see what it does. I mean, these are really difficult problems. And it really begs the question of, should we be putting such heavy and important structures on liquefiable areas? Of course, they're extremely valuable to San Francisco. I mean, it would be a painful decision, but I think the real decision was to develop SOMA with tall high-rise buildings. Is that a good idea? I'm not so sure it is.
Dave, let me just intervene and say that if anybody has a question for our panelists, you should go to the little reactions button at the bottom of your toolbar. And it has a place where you can just press reactions, and then you can get your hand raised, and we can go to that kind of hand raising. I see that Merle has already raised his hand. Glenn has already raised his hand. But generally speaking, we go to our CSFN members first. Is that okay with you, Dave, to go to questions now?
Certainly.
Okay, so first question is Glenn. You're on.
Thank you. And what a wonderful discussion. I really appreciated it. But I wanted to mention, when I was going to school in landscape architecture, they were mentioning that concrete has a life expectancy of 100 years. And there was some Roman concrete that was made in the Colosseum that has lasted for 2,000 years. So the question is, this normal concrete that we have that makes these buildings so tall, if they don't, this statement of 2,500 years for these buildings to last, I don't get it. It just seems to me it's not going to work. It's going to last 100 years. That's my opinion, and that's a question.
Well, nobody says the building's going to last for 2,500 years. The idea is that in 2,500 years, you'd expect this type of building to get a ground motion that would destroy that type of building.
Yeah, and let me put it in a slightly different way. The way that structural engineers think about this 2,500-year business, what we're really designing for is we assume, well, what if the building is only there for 50 years? And we want it to be pretty safe in shaking that has a really low chance of occurring in that 50 years. So it's sort of, what is an upper bound level of shaking that would happen to that building during its life of 50 years? And well, what's an upper bound? Let's say it's something like only 2 chances in 100 that shaking will be stronger than that in the coming 50 years. So that's a 2% probability of being exceeded in 50 years. If you divide 50 by 2%, you get 2,500 years. So that's how we get to this 2,500-year business. So it's this. As I suggested before, the problem is the way that the structural engineers abbreviate that complex idea. We say, we're thinking 2% exceedance probability in a reasonable life, low but non-zero probability of being exceeded in its lifetime. And then just to make that very brief, we say 2,500 years shaking, and everybody gets the impression that nothing's going to go wrong until 499 years from now.
Well, and from my point of view, the biggest problem with using that number is that it tells society this problem is solved. There's
Exactly.
no one
Right.
else says the climate change problem is solved. We don't say that the energy problem is solved, all pestilence, all our other problems are first order problems, but the earthquake problem, thank God it's solved, because we know how to calculate probabilities out to 2,500 years, which by the way is crazy. I mean, so when we make this message, it gives people the idea we know what we're doing.
Okay, I don't see any more CSFN hands raised. So Merle, over to you for your question.
Yeah, I went to architecture school. I'm an architect, and I studied structural engineering in the 60s. And the moment frame was, I believe, really touted to be the answer to a lot of structural questions. So my question is, if the welds are not strong enough and they're not going to work and we have to retrofit, how would we do that? What kind of a detail would be required to bring it up to what you feel now would be worth, what was it, $50,000 per connection?
Per
Yeah.
retrofit.
There's well, there's a few ways to do the retrofit. You have to take all the fireproofing, all the cover off the connection, all the fireproofing off the steel. You have to dig out the welds, and then you replace it with, there's a few ways to connect the column to the beam with, you put in an angle in the top, an angle iron in the bottom, an L-shaped piece of steel in the top and the bottom. You bolt it to the L-shaped piece of steel to the column. You bolt it to the beam. It's a little bit more complicated than that. There's more bits of steel that go in there, but basically you're replacing the moment connection so that it's not transferred through the weld. It's transferred through these new bits of steel. There's another way that you can weaken the beam, and that's complicated, and I won't go into that.
So it's basically going to bolted connection with extra steel.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And there are other, it's basically going to a bolt connection, and there are other variations that you can do too. But it's, you remove the bad weld and you replace the connection with a new moment connection.
But when you were going to school, they were talking about in architecture the advantages of frame buildings, and there are many architectural advantages. But when they talk about frame, there are two ways. Again, you can make the frame out of reinforced concrete, or you can make it out of steel. And the code basically says they're mostly equivalent materials, even though we know they come apart differently, and the way you actually make them is quite different. Fixing the steel frames is easier in some ways than fixing the concrete frames. I mean, how do you get into the columns and beams and change the reinforcing? It's very hard to do. What people generally do, they either make them bigger and wrap them in some sort of confining carbon fiber or steel around the concrete to confine it. But the concrete frame building is been the real killer globally, and it promises to be the real killer in California as well.
Dave, I'm not seeing any questions from CSFN members or anybody else, so I guess it's up to you to wrap things up, ask a question, make a statement, or ask each panelist for a closing statement. It's up to
Can
you.
I ask another question?
Real
May
quick,
I ask another?
real
Yeah,
quick.
in Anchorage, the earthquake was 10 points, and in San Francisco, if we had 10 points on the Richter scale, is that when what you're talking about a higher one, are you still talking about 9.8?
I don't think San Francisco, I'm not a seismologist, so maybe Dr. Heaton should share. I don't think San Francisco can get a 10.0.
No one's ever seen a 10. We've seen a 9.5. But those earthquakes bigger than 9, so far we've only seen them at what we call subduction zones, where the ocean floor is being shoved under the continent. For us on the West Coast, that means basically from Cape Mendocino north into British Columbia is the only place that's happening in the Western US, and Alaska, of course. Alaska was at 9.25. What would happen to San Francisco if it was where Anchorage is? I have no idea. I wouldn't want to be there. I would say that.
Dropped a whole floor downtown Anchorage. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Dave, it's up to you to close this up. We still have to have our business meeting after this.
Well, the closest thing to a summation, I would say it seems like a recurring theme is that we don't know. And if you don't know, you probably should do what Dr. Richter of the scale suggested. Don't build skyscrapers in California. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists for coming.
And remember to drop, cover, and hold.
And be happy and enjoy life while you can.
Right, exactly. Thank you very much to our distinguished panel.